Once upon a time, in a modest apartment in a bustling city, there lived a young man named Gregor Samsa. Gregor was the sole breadwinner for his family, which consisted of his father, mother, and sister, Greta. He worked as a traveling salesman, a job he despised, but he was devoted to his family and felt responsible for their financial well-being. Every morning, he would wake up early, don his suit, and prepare for the long day ahead, often dreaming of a life free from the burdens of work. One fateful morning, as the sun peeked through the blinds, Gregor awoke to find himself transformed into a monstrous insect. His once human body had become a grotesque shell, with multiple legs and a hard exoskeleton. Panic surged through him as he struggled to comprehend his new reality. The clock ticked ominously, and the thought of missing work sent waves of fear through him. He was terrified of how his family would react if they discovered him late for his job. As he attempted to rise from his bed, his new body proved unwieldy. His legs flailed awkwardly, and the realization struck him that he could no longer stand upright. Despite his condition, he was still consumed with thoughts of his responsibilities. The weight of his family's expectations bore down on him, and he thought of the financial burden they would face without his income. He tried to call out to his family, but all that escaped his mouth was a series of strange, guttural sounds. His anxious thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his mother's voice calling for him. She was worried about his tardiness. Gregor's heart raced. He wanted to reassure her, to explain that he would be out soon. But how could he convey the truth of his situation? In a moment of desperation, he tried to push against the bed, but his body betrayed him, and he fell to the floor with a thud. Hearing the noise, his family rushed to his room. His father, mother, and sister gathered at the door, wide-eyed and horrified by the sight before them. They could hardly comprehend the grotesque creature that had replaced their son. Gregor felt a pang of sorrow as he realized that his transformation had shattered their image of him. He could see the fear in their eyes, the confusion, and the growing repulsion. Greta was the first to recover from the shock. She stepped forward, her heart racing with concern for her brother. Despite her fear, she attempted to approach him gently, but her father pulled her back, cautioning her to stay away from the creature. Gregor, desperate for their understanding, tried to crawl toward them, but his movements only heightened their horror. In their eyes, he was no longer Gregor, he was a monster. Days turned into weeks, and as Gregor struggled to adjust to his new life, his family grappled with the implications of his transformation. Initially, they cared for him, bringing him food and attempting to clean his room, but their patience quickly wore thin. Greta, who had once been his closest ally, became increasingly resentful. The burden of caring for Gregor fell heavily on her shoulders, and she began to view him as an inconvenience rather than a beloved brother. Gregor, trapped in his own body, found solace in the small moments of connection he shared with Greta. Occasionally, she would sit by his side, speaking to him as if he were still the brother she once knew. He would listen intently, though he could only respond with the soft hisses and clicks of his insect form. During these moments, he felt a flicker of hope that their bond could endure, even in the face of such unimaginable change. However, as time passed, the family's situation grew dire. Their financial stability crumbled without Gregor's income. His father, once a proud man, was forced to take a job as a lowly laborer. His mother fell ill from the stress, and Greta, overwhelmed, struggled to maintain the household. The once cozy apartment turned into a claustrophobic prison, filled with tension and despair. Grigor's presence became a constant reminder of their misfortune. The family's pity turned to frustration, and the love they had once shown him eroded into resentment. They began to avoid him, shutting him away in his room, as if he were a burden too heavy to bear. The warmth of familial affection faded, replaced by cold indifference. One evening, as the family discussed their dire circumstances, Gregor overheard a conversation that shattered what little hope remained. They spoke of the need to get rid of him, to find a way to move on without the burden of his existence. Gregor, horrified, realized that he was no longer a part of their lives, but a mere obstacle in their path to normalcy. The weight of loneliness crushed him, and he retreated deeper into the shadows of his room. As the days grew darker, Greta's kindness waned. She no longer visited him as she once did, and the family's neglect intensified. Gregor began to lose his sense of self, feeling more like a creature than a man. He spent his days hiding in the corners of his room, watching the world outside his window, longing for the life he had lost. One day, in a moment of desperation, Gregor ventured out of his room, driven by a flicker of hope. He wanted to see his family, to remind them of the bond they once shared. He crawled slowly into the living room, but his appearance sent his family into a frenzy. His father, horrified at the sight of his transformed son, hurled an object at him, forcing Gregor back into the shadows. The encounter shattered any remaining connection between them. Gregor understood that he was no longer part of their world. He was a burden, a reminder of their misfortunes, and they could no longer bear the weight of his existence. The realization crushed him, but he accepted his fate with a heavy heart. As the weeks turned into months, Gregor's physical condition worsened. He became weaker, his body frail and emaciated. He spent his days in solitude, reflecting on the life he had once cherished. Memories of laughter, family dinners, and shared dreams haunted him. He longed for the warmth of human connection, for the love of his family, but those moments felt like distant echoes fading into silence. One cold, dreary evening, Gregor lay on the floor of his room, too weak to move. As he closed his eyes, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had fought long enough against the tide of despair. Perhaps it was time to let go. In that moment, he surrendered to the darkness, embracing the void that awaited him. The next morning, the Samsa family discovered Gregor's lifeless body. Instead of mourning the loss of their son, they felt an overwhelming sense of relief. His death marked the end of their burden, the release from the nightmare that had consumed their lives. They gathered together, sharing a moment of quiet contemplation, before turning their attention to the future. With Gregor gone, the family felt unshackled from their despair. They began to make plans for a new life, free from the weight of their past. Greta blossomed into a young woman, her spirit renewed by the absence of her brother. As they strolled through the city, she and her parents looked forward to a brighter future, filled with possibilities. In the end, Gregor's transformation had not only changed him, but had irrevocably altered the lives of those he loved. As they moved on, the memory of their son faded into the background, a shadow of what once was. The Samsa family learned to adapt, to survive and to rebuild their lives without him. And so, the story of Gregor Samsa, the young man who became a monstrous insect, came to a tragic close. In his metamorphosis, he had hoped for understanding, for compassion, but instead found rejection and despair. His life became a haunting reminder of the fragility of human connections and the devastating impact of isolation.